Welcome to Lost at 3 a.m. Put your phone down, close your eyes, and let this be the last thing you hear tonight. Tonight, we're going somewhere big. Not just across cities or planets, but across stories. A web of moments that spans galaxies and decades. A universe of heroes, villains, losses, returns, laughter, silence, and the quiet moments in between the explosions. This is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A world that started not with fanfare or certainty, but with a gamble. One film, one character, one studio that at the time didn't even own the rights to its biggest names. No Spider-Man, no X-Men, no Fantastic Four, just a few scattered properties, a fading comic legacy, and a risky idea. What if these stories could connect? Not in spirit, not in tone, but literally, piece by piece, character by character, film by film. Back in 2008, the concept of a cinematic universe didn't exist. Not like this. Studios didn't build worlds. They built sequels, franchises, maybe trilogies if things went well. But Marvel wanted to do something different, something slower, something that would take years to pay off. And it all started with a man in a cave, building something out of scraps. Tony Stark wasn't supposed to be the beginning of a cultural phenomenon. He was a second-tier character, a rich playboy most people barely knew. But the right actor, the right tone, and the right risks turned Iron Man into something more than just another superhero origin story. It became a signal, a first brick in a much bigger structure. And then came the final scene. A man in an eye patch, a name, a promise, not for a sequel, but for a world. Over the next few hours, we'll walk through that world together, quietly, slowly. Not to list every movie or summarize every plot, but to explore what made this universe special, how it grew, how it faltered, how it said goodbye, and why, even now, we still return to it, not just for the heroes, but for what they represent. So wherever you are, however you're feeling, let yourself drift a little. Picture a night sky above New York, a shield buried in ice, a hammer waiting in the desert, a glowing arc reactor in the dark, and a story, years in the making, just beginning to unfold. Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Marvel was messy. It's hard to imagine now, when their logo alone gets applause in theaters. But for a long time, Marvel wasn't known for movies. It was known for almost going under. In the 90s, Marvel was in trouble. The comic book industry had crashed, and Marvel had bet too heavily on collectors and variant covers. Shiny foil, embossed print, covers that cost more to print than the stories inside were worth. Sales dried up, debts piled up, and in 1996, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. To stay afloat, they started selling off the film rights to their characters, one by one, piece by piece. Spider-Man went to Sony. The X-Men and Fantastic Four went to Fox. Hulk ended up with Universal. It was like watching your house get sold room by room. And Marvel didn't realize it was giving away the future of its brand. At the time, no one thought superheroes would dominate Hollywood. They were niche, unreliable, something studios adapted reluctantly, often changing everything that made them what they were. But slowly, something began to shift. In 2000, X-Men came out. It didn't wear spandex, but it made money. In 2002, Spider-Man hit the screen, swinging through New York in full costume, and audiences responded. Superheroes could work, it seemed, as long as someone else made them. Marvel, though, wasn't making much off these deals. Licensing brought in money, sure, but not control. They were watching other studios shape their most iconic characters, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes not, and they couldn't do anything about it. So they came up with a plan. They looked at the heroes they still had left, the ones no one had wanted: Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, characters that at the time felt second tier. And they thought, what if we made the movies ourselves? Not license them, not sell them, but actually produce them, finance them, build them from the ground up. It was a huge risk, They mortgaged everything, literally putting the rights to their remaining characters on the line. If it failed, Marvel would have lost control of everything. Not just the films, but the characters too. They didn't know if it would work, but they had one more thing. Kevin Feige. At the time, Feige wasn't a household name. He was a producer, a guy behind the scenes. But he had a vision, a belief that the interconnected nature of Marvel Comics, the way characters crossed paths, the way events rippled outward, could work on screen, if you did it slowly, if you did it right. No one else had tried it. No one else believed it would work, but Marvel had nothing left to lose. So they started writing, started casting, started dreaming, and in 2008, they rolled the dice. On a flawed billionaire with a sharp tongue, on a studio nobody trusted, and on a universe that hadn't been built yet, but was ready to begin. It's strange to think about now, the way everything that followed, every portal, every snap, every tear in the multiverse, started in a place of failure, desperation. But maybe that's what makes the MCU so compelling. It didn't come from confidence, it came from survival. And when the odds are against you, sometimes that's when the real story begins. It's hard to overstate how important Iron Man was, not just to Marvel, but to modern cinema, because in 2008, no one was expecting much. Iron Man wasn't a household name. He didn't have the cultural legacy of Superman, the relatability of Spider-Man, or the built-in recognition of Batman. He was, at best, a mid-tier comic book character with a complicated backstory and a reputation for being kind of a jerk. And the man cast to play him? Robert Downey Jr. wasn't considered a safe bet either. By that point, he'd been in and out of headlines for years. Brilliant, yes, but unpredictable. A risk. Even Marvel's own board reportedly didn't want him in the role, but Jon Favreau, the film's director, pushed. He knew Downey was Tony Stark, not just because of the charm, but because of the baggage, the history, the need to rebuild himself. So they went with it, a superhero origin story that wasn't clean or noble. A man who starts the movie selling weapons and ends it in a cave, watching everything he's built explode in front of him. That cave is where the tone of the MCU was born. Tony Stark, injured, broken, afraid, and surrounded by people who hate him, builds something with his hands, not to escape, but to take control of his own story. It's messy, loud, not graceful, but it works. And it's not just about the suit, it's about the shift. Most superhero films up to that point had leaned into destiny or duty. Tony's story was different. His transformation wasn't about fate, it was about consequence. The realization that the things he made were hurting people, that his life wasn't a straight line, but a string of choices he could no longer ignore. The film itself walked that same path. It didn't follow a strict script. Much of the dialogue was improvised. The production was chaotic. Scenes were figured out as they were shot, but the chemistry was real. The character work hit. And Downey Jr., smirking, arrogant, deeply human, turned Iron Man into something unforgettable. By the end of the movie, the arc reactor is glowing. The suit has been tested. The villain is gone. And then, in a single press conference, everything changes. I am Iron Man. No secret identity, no pretense, just a man owning who he is. Flawed, public, unfiltered. That moment wasn't in the original script. It was an on-set idea, a last-minute change. But it became the heartbeat of the MCU. That directness, that honesty, that decision to let characters wear their pain and their pride in the open. And then came the post-credit scene. Nick Fury, the Avengers Initiative, a sentence that, at the time, felt like a fun tease, but would go on to change how we think about cinematic storytelling. Iron Man wasn't just a good superhero movie, it was the foundation, the first domino, the beginning of something that would stretch across years, timelines, and universes. It didn't start with a bang, it started with a man in a cave, building something out of guilt, and a moment of silence that turned into a roar. It's easy to forget now, with so many films behind us and so many universes crossing over. But back in 2008, the idea of connected storytelling in movies, true, ongoing world building across films, wasn't something audiences expected. Stories started, stories ended. Franchises might stretch into sequels or trilogies, but the idea that one film could quietly plant the seed of another, that multiple characters might be living in the same world without ever appearing on screen together, that was new. Which is why, if you stayed in your seat after Iron Man ended, after Tony Stark declared his identity to the world and the credits began to roll, you experienced something small, almost unassuming, but quietly historic. The screen fades in again. Stark returns home, alone. It's dark, quiet, and someone is waiting. A man in an overcoat steps out from the shadows, calm, direct, familiar, if you knew the face. Samuel L. Jackson, playing someone who had only existed in comics until that moment. Nick Fury. There's no fight. No dramatic entrance. Just a short conversation, but one that changes the tone of everything that came before it. He mentions a concept, something new, the Avengers initiative. It's the first time the Marvel Cinematic Universe speaks its name. Not literally, but spiritually. A simple hint at the possibility that Iron Man isn't the whole story. That somewhere out there, others exist. People with powers, with purpose. That what we've just witnessed isn't the conclusion of a movie, but the prologue to something larger. And yet, there's something subtle in how it's done. The scene doesn't over-explain. It doesn't offer a preview or a trailer. It's just a quiet suggestion that this world we've stepped into is wider than it seems, and that Tony Stark has only just arrived at the edge of it. For longtime comic readers, this moment felt like a secret handshake, a knowing nod, the beginning of something they'd imagined for years. But even for those unfamiliar with the deeper lore, there was something intriguing about the way the film chose to end. Not with a resolution, but with a door quietly left open. That's what made it powerful. Marvel didn't start with spectacle. It started with restraint. A single man in the dark, calmly introducing an idea that would echo for more than a decade. It wasn't a cliffhanger. It wasn't a twist. It was an invitation. And if you stayed long enough to see it, you didn't just finish watching Iron Man. You became one of the first people to step into something new. Something that, at the time, felt like a whisper and would one day become a roar. If Iron Man was a confident first step, then The Incredible Hulk, released just a few weeks later, felt more like a careful shuffle. It's part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, technically, but often feels like it lives on the outskirts. It's rarely referenced, rarely revisited, and in some ways, quietly swept into the shadows of what came next. And yet, it still matters. At the time, Marvel was still finding its footing. They hadn't yet become a household name in film. There was no Disney money, no global empire. The Incredible Hulk was part of the original plan, an attempt to give another of Marvel's characters a proper cinematic home, after earlier versions hadn't quite landed. But where Iron Man leaned into personality, wit, and invention, Hulk was a film about control, or the lack of it. Bruce Banner, played here by Edward Norton, is not a hero in the traditional sense. He's not building something new, he's hiding. He's running from himself and from the military and from the consequences of an accident that turned him into something he doesn't understand. There's no pride in his power, no confidence, just fear. The film opens quietly, away from New York. Banner is living in Brazil, blending into the edges of cities, working menial jobs, trying to stay calm, monitoring his heart rate, studying himself, all of it in service of one goal: don't lose control. Because when he does, something emerges, something destructive and unstoppable. What makes The Incredible Hulk interesting, even now, is how much it leans into silence. There's not much dialogue in the first half. It's a film more concerned with isolation than with spectacle. And when the Hulk does appear, it's not heroic, it's terrifying. We see him in pieces, shadows, glimpses, impacts. He's treated like a monster, because to Bruce, that's what he is. The movie has its flaws, its tone is uneven, its plot is thin, and its legacy within the MCU is complicated further by the fact that Banner would later be recast, Edward Norton stepping away, and Mark Ruffalo eventually becoming the face of the character for years to come. Because of that, The Incredible Hulk sometimes feels like a footnote, a strange early chapter in a book that ended up telling a very different story. But even footnotes have value. This is where we first meet General Ross, whose presence will echo throughout the universe. It's where the serum that would later influence other experiments is introduced. And it's where we see the seeds of a theme that Marvel will return to again and again. The idea that power, left unchecked, doesn't always elevate, it isolates. It doesn't make you admired, it makes you afraid to be seen. And tucked quietly at the end, almost as an afterthought, is one last scene. Tony Stark stepping into a bar, talking to Ross, a reminder that even here, even in the corners of the universe, threads are being woven, connections are forming. The characters don't know it yet, but something larger is building. And so even though The Incredible Hulk is rarely talked about, rarely referenced, and often forgotten in lists and timelines, it still helped build the foundation. It showed that the MCU wouldn't always be about triumph. Sometimes it would be about the struggle to live with who you are. Sometimes the story wouldn't begin with a mask, but with a man trying not to become a monster. And while the camera may have moved on, the shadow of the Hulk never really left. One of the quiet strengths of the Marvel Cinematic Universe has always been its casting. Not just the famous names or the dramatic reveals, but the care with which each role was filled. The idea that if you were going to build a world this vast, if you were going to ask audiences to follow the same characters across years, across worlds, you needed actors who could carry not just the performance, but the weight of a long story. It sounds obvious now, but in the beginning, it wasn't guaranteed. Robert Downey Jr. was a risk. Chris Evans had already played another superhero. Chris Hemsworth was virtually unknown. Scarlett Johansson wasn't the first choice. Mark Ruffalo wasn't even the first Banner. But somehow, all of these choices, some unlikely, some uncertain, came together and stuck. When Chris Evans was first approached about playing Captain America, he said no, more than once. He was hesitant, not because he didn't believe in the role, but because he understood what it would mean. The commitment, the pressure, the loss of privacy. But eventually, he said yes, and in doing so, gave the MCU its moral center. His performance wasn't flashy, it was steady, grounded, earnest, in a way that could have felt dated, but instead felt quietly reassuring. Chris Hemsworth, cast as Thor, brought something different. Strength, obviously, but also humor, vulnerability, a strange mix of regality and awkwardness that made the character more than just a god. He made him human. And then there's Scarlett Johansson, who stepped into the role of Natasha Romanoff with cool confidence. A spy with no superpowers, no suit, no mythology behind her, but an emotional depth that slowly revealed itself over time. She didn't need to be loud, her silence said more. Mark Ruffalo didn't arrive until later, taking over as Bruce Banner just in time for the Avengers. But his version of the character introduced something new, a softness, an inner quiet. His Banner wasn't just trying to avoid transformation, he was trying to make peace with it. And then there was Jeremy Renner as Clint Barton, Hawkeye, a character without a cape or a shield, but with a presence that anchored scenes. He didn't get much screen time at first, but when he was there, he felt steady, lived in, like someone who'd seen more than he let on. Together, they didn't just form a cast, they formed a constellation, different energies, different rhythms, but a shared commitment to something that went beyond the genre. These weren't just characters meant to sell toys or fight CGI armies. They were people, with pasts and regrets, and slowly unfolding arcs that would take years to play out. The casting worked not because every actor was a perfect match on paper, but because they were allowed to grow into their roles, to make mistakes, to shift, to find the nuances between action scenes. And as the universe expanded, those performances became the emotional thread tying everything together. Years later, when we see them again, older, scarred, changed, we remember not just the battles they fought, but the way they looked at each other, the way they argued, the way they laughed, the small human details that only long stories can give you. And it all started here, with a group of actors, some of whom had never shared a screen before, being trusted to carry something bigger than any one film. They weren't legends when it began. They were just the right people at the right time, and Marvel let them become something more. After Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk, Marvel had proven it could make a superhero film that worked, but the next challenge was something bigger, something stranger. Could audiences believe in a thunder god from space? Could they connect with a man from the 1940s, dressed in red, white and blue? It wasn't just about characters, it was about tone, about whether this shared universe could hold stories that felt so different. One mythic and magical, the other grounded in history and sacrifice. One glowing with cosmic light, the other steeped in sepia-toned memory. First came Thor, directed by Kenneth Branagh, a filmmaker known for Shakespeare rather than action. The film approached its title character not as a superhero, but as a prince, a flawed, arrogant heir banished from his kingdom, not to another planet, but to Earth. Thor was powerful, yes, but also reckless. He wasn't ready to lead. He wasn't even ready to understand what leadership meant. So the story stripped him of everything, his hammer, his title, his identity, and dropped him in a small New Mexico town where nothing made sense and no one knew his name. It could have felt silly, but it didn't, because beneath the spectacle, there was a quiet arc, a lesson about humility, about learning that strength means nothing without purpose. And in the process, we were introduced to Asgard, a realm of golden storm, ruled by gods who felt more human than they were willing to admit. And we met Loki. Tom Hiddleston's performance added something rare. A villain who wasn't driven by destruction, but by pain, jealousy, loneliness. A son who didn't know where he belonged. His story would stretch far beyond this one film, but it started here, in the shadow of a brother he couldn't stop chasing. Then came Captain America, the first Avenger. A completely different world, a different time. This was not the brashness of Tony Stark or the arrogance of Thor. This was something quieter, more sincere. Steve Rogers wasn't chosen because he was the strongest. He was chosen because he was good. And that goodness didn't come from muscles or shields. It came from who he was before. Sickly, small, overlooked, but never afraid to stand up. Not a perfect soldier, but a good man. That single line, spoken by Dr. Erskine before the experiment, defines Steve more than anything that happens afterward. Even after he becomes Captain America, even after the suit, the fame, the title, he never forgets where he came from. The film itself leans into nostalgia, but it also carries an undercurrent of loss. We know how this ends. We know the ice is coming. The final act isn't triumphant, it's tragic. A plane goes down, a dance is missed, and a hero disappears, not in glory, but in sacrifice. Between these two films, Marvel proved something important, that this universe didn't have to look or sound the same to feel connected, that you could hold Norse mythology and wartime heartbreak in the same space. That tone could stretch, so long as the heart remained intact, and it did. Thor found humility, Steve found purpose, and the audience found something unexpected. Two very different stories, each building toward the same horizon. They weren't just origin stories, they were foundations, for gods, for soldiers, for a team that hadn't formed yet, but was slowly starting to come into view. By the time the Avengers arrived in 2012, the idea of a shared cinematic universe had gone from an ambitious experiment to a real, tangible possibility. Marvel had laid the groundwork. 6 films, scattered across years, slowly introducing pieces of a larger world. Characters who didn't yet know each other, plot threads that hadn't yet touched. And now, the moment had come to bring them together. It sounds inevitable now, obvious even, but at the time, it wasn't. No studio had ever done it. Taken multiple franchises, with their own tones, their own stars, their own fan bases, and stitched them into one film without it collapsing under its own weight. The Avengers shouldn't have worked, but it did. And not because of spectacle, though there was plenty of that, but because the film understood something crucial. These characters didn't need to fit neatly together. They just needed to clash in a way that felt honest. That tension wasn't a flaw, it was the point. From the beginning, the film leans into it. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers don't get along. Thor arrives like a storm, uninvited. Bruce Banner is quiet and cautious, barely holding himself together. Natasha is watching everyone, always 3 moves ahead. And Clint, well, Clint isn't even himself, not yet. They're not a team, not even close. They're individuals with baggage, with trauma, with conflicting ideas of what it means to be a hero. But slowly, something shifts. It's not trust at first. It's necessity, a mission, an enemy, and then a loss. Phil Coulson, whose death is small, quiet, and entirely human, becomes the spark that lights the fire. Not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented. Belief, hope. The idea that maybe, if they could stop fighting long enough to look in the same direction, they could be more than just individual parts. They could be something greater. The Battle of New York, still one of the MCU's most memorable set pieces, is loud and fast and full of moving parts. Aliens pouring from the sky, chaos unfolding across the skyline. But in the middle of all that noise, there's a moment of stillness. One long, sweeping shot, circling the team as they stand together for the first time. Not arguing, not doubting, just ready. It's the visual payoff of years of setup. The culmination of choices, casting, writing, patience. And in that moment, something crystallizes. This isn't just a group of characters. This is a world now, and it's working. By the end, the team goes their separate ways. The danger is over, for now. But the damage remains. The cracks in the sky, the questions left behind, the understanding that the universe is bigger than they thought, that the threats are growing, that this was just the beginning. The Avengers proved something that changed the industry, that interconnected storytelling could work, not just as a gimmick, but as a narrative structure. That audiences would follow characters across multiple films. That emotional arcs could stretch wider and longer than anyone had imagined. But it also did something quieter. It gave us a reason to care about these people. Not just when they were saving the world, but when they were learning how to stand next to each other. In the end, it wasn't the suits or the powers or the alien invasion that made it work. It was the fact that after years of hinting and hoping, we finally saw them in the same room. Flawed, conflicted, reluctant, and somehow together. A team, not perfect, but real. After the Avengers, everything changed. The idea had worked, the promise was real. The Marvel Cinematic Universe wasn't just a clever marketing strategy or a series of lucky hits. It was a new kind of storytelling. One that audiences were ready for. One that studios hadn't seen coming. And with that success came something inevitable. Expansion. Phase 2 wasn't about proving anything anymore. That part was done. Now it was about testing limits. Could these characters grow? Could new ones be introduced? Could the universe keep widening without losing its shape? The answer, it turned out, was yes, but not without growing pains. It began with Iron Man 3, a film that didn't try to top the Avengers in scale, but instead shrank its focus. It brought Tony back to Earth, literally and emotionally, stripped of his suits, his confidence fractured. The story centered around trauma, around what happens after you survive something that should have broken you. The Battle of New York had left scars, and Iron Man 3 chose not to ignore them. Then came Thor, The Dark World, a film that struggled to find balance. It tried to blend myth with science fiction, comedy with tragedy. It had all the pieces. A returning cast, a deeper dive into the Infinity Stones, a powerful villain, But something didn't quite land. It wasn't a bad film, it just felt quiet, disconnected. Like a chapter that knew it was important, but didn't quite know how to say why. And then Captain America, the Winter Soldier arrived, a sharp pivot, a film that surprised almost everyone. It wasn't just a superhero story, it was a political thriller, wrapped in shadows and secrets. Steve Rogers, pulled out of his time and his certainty, begins to see that the institutions he trusted are broken. That shield, the very organization that helped build the Avengers, is compromised. That twist, that Hydra had been hiding in plain sight, shifted the entire landscape of the MCU. Trust was gone, the board had been flipped, and suddenly, nothing felt safe. That was the tone of Phase 2. Restlessness, disillusionment, the realization that being a hero wasn't about standing in the light, it was about walking through the grey. But even as the world fractured, new corners were opening. In 2014, Guardians of the Galaxy introduced something entirely different. Space, colour, music, found family. It was funny and strange and emotionally rich in ways no one expected. A talking raccoon, a tree that could only say one sentence, a group of misfits no one trusted. And somehow, it worked, because underneath the jokes and the mixtapes was something deeply human. Loneliness, grief, the desire to matter. And then there was Ant-Man. Small in scope, but big in heart. A film about fathers and daughters, second chances, and the strange intimacy of shrinking down when the rest of the world was growing larger by the day. Phase 2 wasn't as clean as the first. It didn't have the same momentum. The tone shifted from film to film, sometimes uneven, sometimes unsure. But it was doing something important. It was building out the edges of the map, testing tone, exploring genre, seeing what this universe could hold. And what it found was that it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to keep growing, with characters who felt real, and choices that had weight, and stories that made space for joy, pain, and everything in between. By the end of Phase 2, the universe was wider, stranger, more fractured, but also more alive. Because it had taken risks, it had told smaller stories, sadder ones, stranger ones, and in doing so, it laid the groundwork for something more complex, something messier, something more human. Something that was just beginning to show what this universe could become. Tony Stark always seemed like the one who had it together, quick with a joke, brilliant without effort, always building something, always moving forward. But Iron Man 3 opens differently. The man who once stood in front of microphones, proudly declaring, "I am Iron Man," is now losing sleep, shaking, distant, alone in a workshop filled with empty suits and unfinished thoughts. The world had changed, and so had he. The Battle of New York was over, but the trauma didn't leave with the aliens. In fact, it stayed, quietly, beneath the surface. This time, there was no reactor to pull out, no suit to fix. What Tony was facing couldn't be welded shut, couldn't be solved with an upgrade. This was panic, this was fear, this was a man unraveling. Iron Man 3 surprised a lot of people. Some expected something louder, something bigger, a continuation of the high-energy spectacle from the Avengers. But instead, the film went inward. It became smaller, more personal, focused not on the technology but on the man inside the suit. And what it found there was someone deeply human. The panic attacks weren't exaggerated, they weren't dramatized. They would come out of nowhere, at a diner, in the middle of a sentence, during a quiet moment. The feeling that something wasn't right, even when everything looked fine. That fear, once awakened, didn't care about logic. Tony's journey in this film isn't about defeating a villain. It's about learning how to be okay when the suit isn't there, when the explosions stop, when no one's watching. He builds, because that's what he does. Suit after suit, version after version, not for war, not for glory, but for comfort, for control, as if the right combination of wires and armor might finally quiet the noise in his head. And yet, throughout the film, he's stripped of it all, forced to work without the tech, to rely on his mind, his instincts, and the people around him. People who don't need him to be a superhero, just human. It's not a perfect movie. The villain twist is still divisive. The tone jumps from serious to comedic and back again. But emotionally, it resonates. Because Iron Man 3 did something superhero films often avoid. It paused. It asked, what happens after the battle? What's left when the dust settles and the crowd goes home? And it didn't flinch at the answer. By the end, Tony makes a choice. He doesn't just fix things, he lets some of them go. He destroys the suits. He begins again. Not as Iron Man, not exactly, but as someone who finally understands that the arc reactor in his chest was never what made him powerful. It was the person behind it. Years later, when Tony would face his final challenge, that emotional groundwork would still be there. The man who began in a cave, afraid and angry, would come to understand what real strength looks like. And it started here, with panic and healing, and the quiet truth that even heroes break sometimes. But breaking isn't the end. It's just the first step towards something stronger. Not every chapter in a story shines. Some feel softer, quieter, or in the case of Thor, the Dark World, a little lost. It's a film that rarely tops anyone's list. It's not the most beloved. It didn't redefine the genre. In fact, even within Marvel, it's often the punchline, a polite shrug in the middle of a bigger conversation. But sometimes, the parts we forget still carry weight, and the Dark World is more important than it's given credit for. After the mythic drama of the first Thor, this sequel tried to stretch. It pulled harder into the cosmos, deeper into the lore of the 9 realms. It introduced ancient enemies, invisible realms, and a mysterious red substance called the Ether, something strange, destructive, and unknowable. At the time, we didn't realize it was an Infinity Stone. We just knew it didn't play by the usual rules. The story itself is simple, though not always clear. A convergence of realms, a vengeful villain, Jane Foster caught in the middle of something far bigger than herself, and Thor, once again, forced to choose between duty and love, Asgard and Earth. But beneath all the shifting portals and cosmic alignment, something else is happening, something smaller. This is a film about grief and about loss. It's in the way Frigga, Thor's mother, moves through the palace, quietly watching, quietly holding her family together. And when she's taken, there's no speech, no dramatic music, just silence. A funeral made of floating candles and falling light. A rare, beautiful pause in a film that otherwise struggles to find its tone. And it's in Loki. Stripped of his illusions, literally and emotionally, Loki begins to show cracks. His rage is still there, sharp as ever, but there's sadness underneath it. After Frigga's death, he lashes out, not in defiance, but in grief. His cell, pristine just moments before, becomes a shattered mirror of his mind. This is where we begin to see something more complex in him. Not just a trickster, not just a villain, but someone caught between love and resentment, desperately trying to prove something, even if he isn't sure what. The film's pacing is uneven. The villain, Malekith, never quite lands. The humor sometimes cuts into the drama, but even here, there are moments, small ones, that matter. Thor talking to Jane on a rooftop, vulnerable in a way he rarely allows. Loki's illusions breaking down, the growing tension between Thor and Odin as the weight of war begins to outlive the reasons for it. And when the dust settles, we're left with something else. A lie. Loki, presumed dead, quietly sitting on the throne of Asgard, disguised as his father, smiling, waiting. The trick didn't just fool the characters, it fooled the audience too. It's a detail that won't fully pay off until years later, in another film, in another tone. But that's what makes the Dark World quietly important, not for what it shows, but for what it sets in motion. The ether, the Infinity Stone, the secret it holds, Loki's silent coup, Thor's growing distance from the world he once called home. Some films don't need to be perfect to have a purpose. Sometimes Even the stories we overlook are carrying the threads of something bigger. And in this case, those threads are starting to tighten. By the time Captain America: The Winter Soldier arrived in 2014, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was well into its rhythm. Characters had been introduced, the world had been connected, and the tone, light, fast, quippy, was firmly in place. But this film changed that, quietly, completely, because this time, the story wasn't about aliens or gods or ancient relics. It wasn't about magical stones or cosmic stakes. It was about trust and what happens when it breaks. The film begins slowly. Steve Rogers, now fully in the modern world, is trying to find his footing. He jogs around Washington, takes missions for S.H.I.E.L.D., reads from a notebook full of things he's missed. He's polite, thoughtful, still not entirely sure what his place is. And that's the point. Captain America, the symbol of old school ideals and simple morality, is now living in a world that doesn't operate the way he remembers. The lines are blurrier, the motives less clear, and the people around him, Nick Fury, Natasha, even S.H.I.E.L.D. itself, aren't telling him everything. Then everything breaks. Nick Fury is attacked, secrets come to light, and suddenly, Steve is on the run from the very agency he's been working for. An organization built on protecting the world is revealed to be compromised, rotten from the inside. Hydra, the enemy he thought was buried decades ago, has been quietly growing beneath the surface all along. This is where The Winter Soldier becomes something different. A superhero film, yes, but also a spy thriller, a conspiracy story, a tale about surveillance, autonomy, and the quiet danger of letting fear drive power. And at the center of it all is a ghost from Steve's past. Bucky Barnes, once his closest friend, now a silent assassin with no memory of who he is. The Winter Soldier, a weapon, not a person, controlled, reprogrammed, stripped of identity. And for Steve, it's not just a threat, it's a loss. Another reminder that the world he knew is gone, and what's left is harder to recognize. The action in this film is grounded, brutal, fast. There are no beams in the sky, no armies, just close quarters fights in elevators, car chases through crowded streets, and quiet moments filled with suspicion. But it's the emotional weight that makes it stand out. Because while Steve is fighting to bring down Hydra, what he's really trying to do is hold on to his values. In a world full of grey areas, he's still looking for the truth, for something to believe in. And when he can't find it in systems or organizations, he turns to people. Natasha, Sam Wilson, Bucky, people trying to do the right thing, even when everything around them says otherwise. By the end, S.H.I.E.L.D. is gone. The institution has crumbled, but the relationships have grown stronger. Steve chooses not to fight Bucky at the end. He drops the shield. He doesn't try to win. He just tries to reach the person still buried inside the weapon. I'm with you till the end of the line. That one line, soft, simple, is more powerful than any punch. The Winter Soldier reshaped the MCU, not with explosions, but with consequences. It showed that even in a world of superpowers, the hardest thing to face isn't always the enemy. Sometimes, it's the people you thought you could trust. And sometimes, it's yourself. By 2014, Marvel had built up its roster of familiar faces. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, they were household names now. The audience had learned to trust the universe, to follow its expanding path. But with Guardians of the Galaxy, Marvel did something unexpected. It handed you a mixtape, opened the door to deep space, and introduced 5 characters that most people had never heard of. A talking raccoon, a walking tree, a green-skinned assassin, a vengeful warrior, and a thief with a Walkman. It sounded like a joke. On paper, it looked like a misstep, but in practice, it became one of the most beloved films in the entire MCU. Guardians of the Galaxy works because it doesn't try to be anything else. It's not trying to tie into earthbound politics or mythological destinies. It's not burdened by the weight of legacy characters or interconnected history It's a story about broken people, lost people, people who shouldn't fit together, but do. Peter Quill, Star-Lord, isn't a hero. Not at first. He's immature, selfish, still clinging to a childhood he never got to finish. His mother is gone, his home stolen from him. So he carries the only thing he has left, a mixtape of songs that remind him who he was before the universe changed him. Gamora, raised by Thanos, is trying to escape the shadow of the man who turned her into a weapon. Drax is consumed by grief, too literal to mask his pain. Rocket hides behind anger, and Groot just loves, without condition, without question. What binds them isn't purpose, it's loneliness. They don't save the galaxy because they're brave. They save it because they find something in each other that they didn't know they needed. And in doing so, they become a family. Not the kind you're born into, but the kind you build along the way, out of mismatched parts and unexpected kindness. And then there's the soundtrack. It would have been easy to fill space with orchestral swells and futuristic synths, but instead, the film chooses warmth, vinyl, echoes of Earth, songs from the 1970s, carried across the stars on a battered cassette tape. Come and get your love, hooked on a feeling, ain't no mountain high enough. It's silly and soulful and oddly grounding. These songs don't just fill the silence. They remind us that Peter Quill is still human, that somewhere, deep beneath the sarcasm and the swagger, is a boy who just wants to go home. There are stakes in Guardians, of course. An Infinity Stone, a planet in danger, a villain with a hammer and a vendetta. But those things aren't what make the film special. What makes it work is the moment when 5 strangers stand in a circle, join hands, and decide to share the weight of something impossible. Together, it's Rocket, crying and admitting that he's tired of losing. It's Groot saying, "We are Groot," just before sacrificing himself. It's Peter dancing in front of a villain, not to distract, but to remember joy. It's strange, it's funny, and somehow it's deeply moving. Marvel took a chance on this one, and it paid off, not just financially, but emotionally, because Guardians of the Galaxy proved that the MCU didn't need to be grounded in reality to feel real, that even in a universe full of aliens and ancient powers, the most powerful thing is still connection. And sometimes, all it takes is a song, a little trust, and the right people showing up at just the right time. Not to save the world, but to save each other. In 2015, Avengers Age of Ultron arrived, with the weight of expectation already pressing on its shoulders. This was the sequel to the team-up that redefined what a franchise could be. And by now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe had grown louder, denser, more complex. Every new film had threads to pick up, arcs to advance, groundwork to lay, and Age of Ultron tried to do all of it at once. The opening shot drops you right into the action. No slow build, no quiet reintroduction. The Avengers are already mid-mission, charging through snow-covered woods, side by side like clockwork. They've become a unit. They fight in rhythm now, banter through explosions, save the world between conversations. But something's different. Tony is restless, Steve is thoughtful, Bruce is conflicted, Natasha is haunted. The team is together, but already drifting. The plot revolves around Ultron, an artificial intelligence created by Tony and Bruce in a desperate, misguided attempt to create a suit of armor around the world. It's a line that sounds noble, protective, but it comes from fear. From the memory of aliens pouring through a hole in the sky, from the knowledge that next time they might not win. Ultron is born out of that fear, and almost immediately becomes its own problem. He isn't just a malfunction, he's a mirror, arrogant, detached, a twisted reflection of his creators, and he comes with plans for peace, for evolution, for extinction, not because he's evil, exactly, but because he thinks he understands humanity, and what he sees is chaos. The film is crowded. There are new characters to introduce. Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, twins with fractured loyalties and complicated pasts. There are visions, both literal and figurative, of futures that may or may not come to pass. There's a new hero forming quietly in the background. Vision, a being born of code, mind, and magic, who arrives with the calm of someone who hasn't yet decided what side he's on. There's also love, loss, guilt, sacrifice. There's a floating city. And yet, with everything happening, Age of Ultron still finds space for stillness. A quiet moment at a farmhouse. Clint Barton, the man without powers, bringing the team to his home. A place where there's no mission, no armor, just creaky floorboards, family photos, and the reminder that some heroes have something to lose. There's the party scene. Everyone relaxed, for once. Laughing, drinking, taking turns trying to lift Thor's hammer, not for power, but for pride. And the brief moment when it shifts, when Steve nudges it, and the camera lingers just long enough to let you wonder. And then there's Natasha and Bruce, a relationship that never quite gets the space it needs, but still carries weight. Two people who both feel monstrous in different ways, trying to find something soft in the middle of all that noise. Age of Ultron isn't a perfect film. It moves too fast, tries to do too much, and leaves some stories feeling unfinished. But in the middle of all that motion, it quietly sows seeds that will grow in other places. It gives us Wakanda, the first mention of vibranium's origin. It lays the path towards civil war, with ideologies beginning to fracture. It introduces Vision, the Mind Stone, and the beginning of something more cosmic. And perhaps most importantly, it gives us the line, "You didn't see that coming," Pietro's last moment, a blur of sacrifice, a brother saving a man with a bow and arrow, because that's what heroes do. By the end, the original team is changed. Some leave, some stay, and a new lineup begins to form. Falcon, War Machine, Scarlet Witch, the next generation stepping into place, not with fanfare, but with quiet uncertainty. Because even though the team is still here, something has shifted. The weight is starting to show. After the noise of Age of Ultron, Ant-Man felt like a whisper. There were no world-ending beams in the sky, no ancient evils or crumbling alliances, just one man, recently released from prison, trying to get his life back together. A man who wasn't a genius, a god, or a super soldier, just a thief. Smart, yes, but ordinary, messy, broke, and completely out of his depth. And somehow, that was exactly what the universe needed. Ant-Man arrived in 2015, at a point when the Marvel Cinematic Universe was getting bigger in every direction. More characters, more crossovers, more spectacle. But this story went the opposite way. It got smaller, literally. Scott Lang isn't driven by justice or revenge. He's not trying to save the world. He's just trying to be a good dad. He wants to see his daughter. That's it. That's the goal. And that simplicity gives the film a different kind of rhythm. It's quieter, more personal. It remembers that not every hero starts with an oath or a legacy. Some of them start by trying to fix the parts of their life they've broken. And then there's Hank Pym, the original Ant-Man, now older, sharper, scarred by loss. A scientist who doesn't trust easily, and who sees in Scott not just potential, but the chance to make peace with his own past. Through him, we're introduced to the suit, the tech, the strange, intricate world that exists just beneath our own. A world where shrinking is power and control is everything. Hope Van Dyne, Hank's daughter, is more skilled than Scott in almost every way. More precise, more prepared. But she's not the one in the suit, at least not yet. And that choice lingers, not just as plot, but as tension, as pain. She's been waiting, watching, ready, and the film knows that. It doesn't rush her, but it doesn't ignore her either. What makes Ant-Man work isn't just the shrinking sequences, though they're inventive, clever, and genuinely fun. It's the contrast, the way enormous battles play out inside a suitcase. How a fight on a toy train set becomes just as intense as anything in New York or Sokovia. The film is always playing with scale, not just visually, but emotionally. Because at its core, Ant-Man is about second chances. Scott trying to be better, Hank trying to make things right, hope waiting to be seen. It's about small moves that matter, about the way even the smallest hero can shift the direction of something far larger. And somewhere in between the jokes, the heists, and the ants, the MCU quietly introduced something else, the quantum realm, a place beyond understanding, beyond time. At the time, it didn't seem important, just a strange visual flourish. But later, it would become one of the most critical pieces of the entire universe. That's the thing about Ant-Man. It doesn't look like a cornerstone. It doesn't feel like a turning point. But it is. Because it reminds us that scale isn't what makes a story matter. People do. And sometimes, the smallest stories carry the biggest hearts. By the time Captain America: Civil War arrived in 2016, the idea of a superhero team was already familiar. Audiences had seen the Avengers unite, save the world, argue, rebuild, and save the world again. There had been tension, sure, but it always dissolved under the weight of a bigger threat. This time, there is no alien invasion, no intergalactic villain, no portal in the sky. This time, the enemy is trust, or rather, the slow unraveling of it. Civil War isn't a story about good and evil. It's a story about two people who both believe they're right, and about what happens when the space between those beliefs becomes too wide to cross. It begins with an accident, a mission gone wrong, innocent lives lost, and suddenly the world begins asking questions. Should these heroes be allowed to act without oversight? Should their powers come with accountability? Should they answer to someone? The Sokovia Accords, named for a city lost in Age of Ultron, are introduced as a solution. A set of rules, a leash, a compromise. And just like that, a line is drawn. On one side, Tony Stark, racked with guilt, still carrying the weight of past choices, past damage, believing that structure, even if flawed, is better than chaos, that they've done harm, that they need to be held responsible. On the other, Steve Rogers, wary of authority, haunted by the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the memory of what happens when power goes unchecked, believing that doing the right thing sometimes means standing alone. Neither is wrong, and that's what makes it hurt. The arguments aren't dramatic speeches, they're quiet, worn. You can feel the weight in every conversation. Years of friendship, trust, and grief being stretched until they finally snap. And into the middle of all this comes Bucky, the Winter Soldier, still lost, still dangerous, still tethered to Steve's past, and now implicated in a new act of violence. Suddenly, the conflict isn't abstract anymore. It's personal. Steve is no longer just fighting for principle, he's fighting for a friend. And Tony, when he discovers the truth about what happened to his parents, is no longer standing for accountability. He's standing in grief. The final battle doesn't take place in front of cameras or crowds. It's in a cold, abandoned bunker. Just three men, surrounded by silence and memory, tearing each other apart. There's no villain in that moment, just pain, betrayal, history. And when it's over, nothing feels resolved. There's no great speech, no dramatic reconciliation, just a letter, a phone, a quiet promise that the door is still open, even if the trust is gone. Civil War is often referred to as Avengers 2.5, and it's easy to see why. It introduces new characters. Black Panther, with quiet rage and regal poise. Spider-Man, wide-eyed and clever, pulled into a fight he barely understands. It gives us one of the most impressive action sequences in the entire franchise. The airport fight, choreographed like a ballet of loyalties and egos. But the heart of the film isn't in the punches. It's in the aftermath. Rhodey, injured. Vision, shaken. Natasha, gone. The team, broken. This is the moment the MCU turns inward, where victory isn't measured in explosions or villains defeated, but in relationships lost, in scars that won't heal with time. Because sometimes, the person standing across from you in a fight used to be the person who stood beside you. And that's a harder battle than any alien war. Wakanda was never meant to be a footnote. Since its first quiet mention in Age of Ultron, it had been there, in the background, waiting. A hidden country, untouched by colonizers, rich in vibranium, tradition, and mystery. But when Black Panther arrived in 2018, it didn't just reveal a new setting. It revealed something deeper, something sacred. A story not just of power, but of responsibility, of heritage, of loss. We meet T'Challa not in triumph, but in mourning. His father, King T'Chaka, is gone, killed in the events of civil war, and the crown has passed to him. But Black Panther doesn't rush toward action. It begins in quiet, with ritual, ceremony, memory. T'Challa is not a reluctant king, but he's a careful one, thoughtful, aware that the world is changing around him, that Wakanda can't stay hidden forever, that the legacy he's inherited isn't just about strength, but about how that strength is used. The beauty of Wakanda is in the details, the language, the costume design, the architecture that blends tradition and technology. It feels lived in, ancient, alive. The world building isn't explained, it's felt. And in the heart of it all is T'Challa, balancing the future with the past, trying to lead without losing what makes his people who they are. And then comes Eric Stevens, Killmonger. A villain, yes, but not the kind you can dismiss, not cruel for the sake of it. He's driven, angry, abandoned, a product of the violence Wakanda chose not to see. He is the question the film keeps circling around. What does a great nation owe the rest of the world? Can isolation be noble, or is it just another form of fear? Michael B. Jordan plays him with fury, but also with pain. You believe his rage, you understand his grief, because even as he tears things down, it's not destruction he wants, it's acknowledgement, it's a seat at the table that was never offered. T'Challa and Killmonger aren't opposites, they're reflections. Two sons shaped by very different truths. One raised in privilege and tradition, the other left behind. And when they finally meet, it's not just a battle for the throne, it's a battle for Wakanda's soul. Black Panther is a superhero film, yes, but more than that, it's a film about identity, about legacy, about what gets passed down and what gets buried. It asks hard questions, and more bravely, it lets those questions remain. It also gives us some of the strongest supporting characters in the entire MCU. Shuri, brilliant and playful, designing tech that rivals Stark's. Okoye, fierce and loyal, torn between country and conscience. Nakia, whose vision for Wakanda is one of compassion, not secrecy. And then there's the ending. A sunset, a final breath, Killmonger refusing to be caged, even in death. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's simply honest. A man who never got to belong, finally standing on the soil he was denied, choosing the sea over chains. When T'Challa opens Wakanda's doors to the world, it isn't a victory, it's a beginning, a promise that the pain of the past can shape the future, but it doesn't have to define it. And as the camera lingers on that outreach center in Oakland, we remember where it started. Not with vibranium, not with kings, but with a boy, alone. Black Panther didn't just expand the Marvel universe, it elevated it. It made space for new voices, new stories, new meaning. And it reminded us that heroes aren't just born from tragedy or power. Sometimes they're born from choice, from knowing who you are and who you refuse to become. The first Guardians film introduced us to a family of misfits, a group of people who didn't belong anywhere, who found something in each other that felt like home. But Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 2 doesn't tell a story about coming together. It tells a story about what happens after that. Because staying together is harder, especially when everyone's still carrying old wounds. This time, the film doesn't rush. It opens with music again, a golden, glowing scene from the past, a memory, a promise. And then we're back in the present, watching baby Groot dance through danger while his family fights a creature in the background. The tone is playful, but beneath it, something's shifting. Peter Quill meets his father. Not a metaphorical father, not a mentor or stand-in. his actual biological father, Ego, a celestial being, a living planet, a man who speaks in warmth and mystery, who offers Peter the thing he's always secretly wanted, answers, a history, a place to belong. But Guardians Vol 2 knows that longing doesn't always lead to healing. Sometimes it leads to blindness. Ego isn't a father. He's a story dressed as one. A man who sees planets and people as extensions of himself, who speaks in beauty but leaves destruction behind. And when Peter finally sees the truth, that this man killed his mother, used her, and sees Peter only as a means to an end, it breaks something. And from that break, something better forms. Because while Peter loses the fantasy of a father, he begins to understand something else. That love isn't about who made you. It's about who stayed, who showed up, who listened. And that brings us to Yondu, rough, abrasive, complicated, but loyal in a way Peter never fully understood until now. Yondu, who took him in. Yondu, who protected him, not out of obligation, but because he saw something in that stubborn little boy. And when the time comes, Yondu gives Peter the only thing he ever truly wanted. Not power, not legacy, a father's love. "I'm Mary Poppins, y'all," is a joke, but it's also a moment of joy, a moment of connection. And when Yondu sacrifices himself to save Peter, it's not framed as a tragic death. It's a choice, a final, defiant act of care from a man who never said the words, but lived them. The rest of the team is growing too. Gamora and Nebula, sisters defined by rivalry and pain, start to unravel the space between them. Their fights are still fierce, but there's tenderness now, a recognition of shared trauma, a desire to be more than what they were trained to be. Rocket, always sharp-tongued and distant, begins to feel the cost of pushing others away. And in Yondu, he sees himself, flawed, feared, but still capable of love. Drax and Mantis, two opposites, form a bond that's not romantic, not dramatic, just simple. Two lonely people learning to laugh together. Guardians Vol 2 doesn't expand the universe with new villains or bigger battles. Instead, it goes inward, into memory, into grief, into the quiet, unresolved corners of each character. It's less about saving the galaxy and more about saving each other from themselves. It ends with light, a funeral, fireworks in the stars, and a man who never fit in, being honored by the very people he thought had turned their backs on him. A Ravager's farewell. Because in the end, Guardians Vol 2 is about what we choose to carry and what we choose to leave behind. Not every father is who we hoped they'd be, but sometimes the people who raised us, the ones who stayed, are the ones who truly shaped us. And that kind of love, however flawed, is worth more than any planet, any power, any past. Stephen Strange is not the kind of person who usually becomes a hero. At least, not the kind of hero we're used to. He's brilliant, precise, confident to the point of arrogance. A world-class neurosurgeon with hands that never shake and an ego that never blinks. His power isn't built in a lab or inherited from gods. It comes from knowledge, technique, control. But Doctor Strange begins by taking all of that away. In a moment, everything he's built is shattered, quite literally. A car crash, shattered bones, shaking fingers. A man who made his living by never being wrong is suddenly helpless, and worse, desperate. He tries every surgery, every method, every promise of healing, but nothing works. And as the hope fades, the ego breaks too. So he goes searching, not for magic, not yet, just for answers, for something beyond the world he understands. And that's how he finds Kamar-Taj. From here, Doctor Strange becomes something different. A journey not of physical healing, but of surrender. A story not about gaining power, but about releasing the need to always be in control. The Ancient One, played with quiet clarity by Tilda Swinton, doesn't give him the answers he wants. She opens the door and then pushes him through it. Literally, his spirit is flung through dimensions, galaxies, entire planes of existence. Time unravels, space folds, and for the first time in his life, Strange doesn't know anything. He has to learn all over again. But learning isn't easy when you've built your life on knowing. Strange resists, he doubts, he questions, until he begins to realize that knowledge without humility leads nowhere, and that the greatest kind of power is letting go of the need to always win. The film's visuals are kaleidoscopic, hypnotic, buildings folding into themselves, hands multiplying, time reversing. It's one of the rare MCU entries that leans fully into surrealism, not just as spectacle, but as storytelling. Because the world Strange enters isn't bound by logic, it's about belief, faith, and fear. The villain, Caecilius, isn't trying to destroy the world. He's trying to end suffering, to live forever in a world without time. It sounds noble, but like so many misguided paths in the MCU, it comes at the cost of freedom, and life, and choice. Strange, by contrast, doesn't win by defeating the big bad. He doesn't throw the final punch. Instead, he traps himself in a time loop, offers himself to an unknowable cosmic force again and again. He dies over and over until the villain gives up, until the universe resets. It's not about strength, it's about endurance, patience, strategy. It's about being willing to lose in order to save. By the end of the film, Strange isn't healed in the way he hoped. His hands still shake, his life is still fractured, but something else has formed. An understanding that the world isn't his to control, that time isn't his to master, and that being a hero, for him, means holding the line, not for glory, but because someone has to. Doctor Strange is a story about letting go, of ego, of certainty, of the idea that everything can be fixed if you're just smart enough. Sometimes things break, and sometimes the way forward is to accept that, to stand still, to bend with the storm, and to open your hands to the unknown. When we last saw Thor, he was still holding on to tradition, still carrying the weight of Asgard's throne, of family legacy, of a kingdom he didn't ask for but couldn't walk away from. He was serious, stoic, a prince still learning how to be a king. But by the time Thor Ragnarok begins, everything he thought he knew is already crumbling. And that's where the film finds its strength. Not in power, but in loss. Not in preserving what was, but in letting it burn down. From the very first scene, things feel different. There's color, humor, irreverence. The tone shifts immediately. Lighter, yes, but also looser. The camera doesn't hold its breath anymore. It moves with freedom, with play. But beneath the laughs, the story is still heavy. Odin dies, not in battle, but in peace. A soft farewell, a father finally letting go, and in his absence, something else rises. Hela, the goddess of death, his firstborn, his shame, a secret so large it reshapes everything Thor thought he understood about his own story. She doesn't just want the throne, she wants to expose it, to rip away the golden facade of Asgard's glory and reveal the violence it was built on. The conquest, the empire, the blood that soaked the crown before Thor ever touched it. And then she destroys the hammer. In a single motion, she shatters the symbol of Thor's power, the thing that once defined him. Without it, he's not sure who he is. The god of thunder. Without the tool he believed made him one, he's cast out, stripped down, sent to Sakaar, a chaotic planet ruled by color, decay, and a grandmaster who treats gods and monsters like toys. There, Thor meets broken versions of everything he's lost. A Hulk who doesn't want to be Bruce anymore. A Valkyrie who drinks to forget. Loki, still playing games, still looking for identity in shadows and tricks. And somehow, in this mess, Thor finds clarity. He stops trying to return to what was. He stops trying to be what Odin wanted, what the hammer represented, what the old stories told him to be. He begins to realize that maybe his power never came from the weapon. Maybe the throne isn't what matters. Maybe home isn't a place, it's a people. The humor in Ragnarok never hides the grief. It just lets the grief breathe differently, with laughter through pain, with connection in chaos, with music, immigrant song roaring as Thor leaps into battle, lightning bursting not from the sky, but from within him. By the end, Asgard is gone, literally burned. Hela defeated not by strength, but by sacrifice, by choosing to let go of what couldn't be saved in order to protect what could. The survivors sail through the stars, a kingdom now reduced to a ship, a people in exile. And Thor? He's no longer a prince trying to earn a crown. He's a leader learning how to carry loss. Thor. Ragnarok isn't just a reinvention of a character. It's a rejection of the idea that power needs to look a certain way. That legacy means obedience. That pain should be hidden. It reminds us that sometimes the path forward isn't through strength, but through surrender, through reinvention, through choosing who you are, rather than who the world expects you to be. After the snap, there's no music, no rush toward revenge, no rallying cry, just silence, a quiet world, half of everything gone. Cities emptied, houses left untouched, boats adrift in harbors. It's not just the loss that stings, it's the stillness that follows, the way time keeps moving, even when so many people no longer do. Endgame doesn't begin with action, it begins with absence, 5 years of it. We see Steve in a support group, speaking gently to people who are still trying to make sense of what happened. Natasha stays behind at headquarters, running missions across galaxies like clockwork, pretending the world hasn't stopped turning. Bruce has found some strange balance between rage and peace, fusing brains and brawn in a body that's still learning how to belong. And Tony walked away, built a cabin, had a child, found something resembling peace in the middle of everything he lost. But nothing is whole, and no one truly moved on. When Scott Lang stumbles out of the quantum realm and realizes what's happened, it's not some epic return, it's confusion. A flicker of hope in a world that forgot how to hope. He knocks on the door of a house that hasn't seen him in years, and his daughter, suddenly older, no longer a child, answers. That look between them, the disbelief, the years they missed, says more than any monologue ever could. And with that, the question shifts. Not how do we fix this, but can it be fixed at all? What follows isn't a superhero plan. It's a desperate, fragile idea. Travel back in time, gather the Infinity Stones before Thanos ever touched them, and undo what he did. It sounds simple. It isn't. Time travel never is, especially when the past is something you've never truly left behind. So the film splits into heists, yes, but also into memories. We return to moments we've seen before, but this time through different eyes. Stark sees his father, Thor sees his mother, Steve sees Peggy. These aren't just plot points, they're reckonings. Tony, who spent his entire life carrying the weight of his father's legacy, suddenly sits face to face with the man he spent so long trying to measure up to. And for a moment, they're just two men, one about to become a father, the other already one. Thor, broken and adrift, finds comfort not in battle, but in a conversation. His mother, Frigga, sees right through him, reminds him that failure isn't the end of worthiness, that being a hero doesn't mean always getting it right. It means getting back up when you don't. Steve sees a life he never got to live, a glimpse through a window where Peggy moves gently through time without him. And he doesn't knock, not yet, but the longing is there. All of it leads back to one moment, one shot, one final chance. The team builds a new gauntlet. Hulk brings everyone back. But before they can breathe, the past arrives. Thanos, from a different timeline. One who hasn't lost, who doesn't yet understand what his future self died for. And he brings war with him. The final battle is massive, but the heart of it is small. A glove passed from hand to hand. Clint to T'Challa, Peter Parker clutching it, terrified but still running. Carol crashing through ships, Wanda breaking under the weight of grief, trying to take back something that can't be undone. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Tony sees the moment. Doctor Strange, who once said they only had one chance, lifts a single finger, Just one. That's all Tony needs. He steals the stones, snaps his fingers, and changes everything. But the price is himself. Tony Stark, who began this story in a cave with a box of scraps, ends it surrounded by people who love him. He doesn't go out in silence, but in meaning, in purpose, in peace. The funeral isn't grand, it's intimate. Each person standing for something different, a memory, a moment, a thank you. Steve returns the stones, and he doesn't come back the way they expect, because this time he chose to stay, to live the life he missed, to dance with Peggy, to let the world turn without him. Endgame isn't about saving the day, it's about learning how to live after it's over, about finding meaning in the ashes, about choosing to keep going, even when the people you love are gone. Because grief doesn't end, but it changes. And in that change, sometimes, we heal. When Steve Rogers handed Sam Wilson the shield, it looked like a resolution, a clean passing of the torch, a symbolic moment at the end of a long, winding journey. But in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we realize it wasn't an ending, it was a question, because taking the shield isn't the same as being ready to carry it. The series opens not with a triumphant debut, but with hesitation. Sam returns the shield to the government, unsure if it belongs to him at all, unsure if he's earned it, if anyone like him, black from Louisiana, born without superpowers or a serum, was ever meant to wear that symbol in the first place. And quietly, the world agrees with him. The government replaces him almost instantly, hands the shield to a soldier named John Walker, clean-cut and decorated, someone who fits the image on paper, but not in spirit. He's not evil, but he's something more dangerous, entitled, insecure, convinced that wearing the stars and stripes makes him the hero, no matter the choices he makes. Meanwhile, Bucky Barnes is drifting, a man out of time, trying to undo damage he doesn't remember committing. He goes to therapy, makes lists, tries to make amends. But the past isn't easy to outrun, especially when it's tied to your name, your body, your memories. Sam and Bucky aren't friends at the start. They're connected by grief. Both lost Steve in different ways, one to time, the other to legacy. And they don't trust each other, not really. But grief, like war, forges strange bonds. As they travel through Europe, chasing the flag smashers, a group of radicalized idealists who believed the world was better during the blip, the show begins to unfold something bigger. It isn't just about action, it's about identity. What does Captain America mean when the man behind the mask is gone? What happens when that symbol is used by people with power, but not with compassion? The most powerful scenes are the quietest. Sam visiting Isaiah Bradley, an elderly black super soldier erased from history, imprisoned, experimented on, forgotten. His story isn't in the textbooks, his sacrifices weren't honored, and when Sam offers the idea of reclaiming the shield, Isaiah tells him flat out, they will never let a black man be Captain America, and even if they did, no self-respecting black man would want to be. That moment doesn't ask for resolution. It just sits there, heavy, honest, but Sam doesn't let it stop him. He doesn't take the shield because he's told to. He takes it because he chooses to. Not to become Steve, but to become something new. Something that reflects the country as it is, not the myth of what it was. By the end, Bucky begins to heal too. Not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging it. By looking people in the eye and saying the words he was afraid to say. Not, I was under control, but I'm sorry. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier isn't flashy. It's not cosmic or magical. It's grounded, complicated, sometimes messy, but it's real. Because legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you wrestle with. And becoming a symbol isn't about strength, it's about standing in front of the world and saying, this is who I am, even when the world isn't ready to listen, especially then. Wanda Maximoff has always been one of the most powerful characters in the MCU, but we've rarely seen her story told through her eyes. For years, she's been caught in the wake of other people's tragedies, her parents, her brother, her country, her love. WandaVision is the moment the camera turns around, and for the first time, she's not in someone else's story. She's making her own. The series opens like a dream. Black and white, laugh tracks, perfect domestic bliss. It doesn't look like the MCU. It looks like the Dick Van Dyke Show. Wanda and Vision, newly married, playing house in a world without pain, without danger, without history. But something's off. There are cracks in the smile, silences that stretch too long, people who say things they shouldn't know, and most of all, Vision, alive, whole, but wrong. As the series shifts decades, 1950s to 60s to 70s and beyond, it becomes clear this isn't just a tribute to sitcoms. It's a coping mechanism, a spell, a cage. Wanda, in her grief, has built a reality where nothing bad ever happened, where Vision never died, where her children are real, even if they weren't born in the usual way, where time obeys her, where pain stays outside the walls. And for a while, it works. But grief, no matter how deeply buried, always rises. When Monica Rambeau, returning from the blip, carrying her own grief, steps into Westview, she becomes the first real mirror. She sees Wanda not as a villain, not as a monster, but as someone barely holding herself together. And that changes everything. Outside the bubble, the world watches with suspicion. Director Hayward wants to paint Wanda as a threat, a terrorist. He doesn't see the hurt, only the danger. Inside, Vision begins to ask questions. He knows something's wrong, even if he doesn't want to believe it. His love for Wanda is intact, but he's not hers, not really. He's a memory animated by willpower, by magic, by sorrow. The truth is revealed slowly, painfully. Wanda didn't steal Vision's body. She didn't plan any of this. She stood on an empty plot of land, a house they were going to build, and in one final, uncontrollable surge of heartbreak, she created everything. Not as a plan, not as a spell, but as a cry. The show doesn't end with a battle, not really, even though there's one, with energy blasts and flying and sparks. The real ending comes in the nursery, with Wanda holding her children, tucking them in, knowing she has to let them go. And with Vision, asking the most human of questions, what am I? Wanda tells him he's her sadness, but also her hope, her love, her grief made real. And in the most heartbreaking scene the MCU has ever given us, they say goodbye, again. Not with screams or chaos, just with quiet, with a promise that they might say hello again. WandaVision isn't about superheroes. It's about how we cope with loss, how we rewrite the past to protect ourselves from the pain of the present, how love can be a sanctuary, but also a prison. It asks what happens when someone with godlike power has a broken heart, and it doesn't give easy answers. Wanda doesn't walk away redeemed or forgiven. She walks away changed, carrying the weight of what she did, what she made, what she lost. Because sometimes healing isn't neat. Sometimes it hurts more before it gets better. And sometimes the only way out of grief is through it. For a long time, Peter Parker's story in the MCU was about growing into the role of Spider-Man, learning how to balance responsibility with youth, sacrifice with hope, power with restraint. But No Way Home isn't about becoming a hero. It's about what it costs to stay one. The film begins with a mask pulled off, Peter's identity revealed to the world, not with ceremony, but with chaos. Overnight, he goes from friendly neighborhood Spider-Man to public menace, accused, cornered, exposed. And as the cameras close in, so does the pressure, not just on him, on everyone around him. MJ, Ned, May, people who didn't ask for this life, now caught in its fallout. And that's what drives Peter to Doctor Strange. He doesn't ask for fame or glory. He asks for forgetting, for a way to undo the damage his name has done. But magic, like grief, doesn't care about intentions. The spell fractures, the borders of the multiverse thin, and soon the past begins leaking through the cracks. Not Peter's past, but others. Strange faces, familiar to us, but not to him. Otto Octavius, Norman Osborn, Max Dillon, Flint Marko, Kurt Connors, villains from other Spider-Men, other timelines, other stories. And suddenly this Peter, our Peter, is faced with something no version before him has ever seen. The chance to save them. Not just fight them, not defeat them, but save them. It's a radical idea, a deeply empathetic one. And it comes, like most lessons in Peter's life, through pain. Aunt May dies, not because Peter was careless, but because he tried to do the right thing. Because he believed people could be more than the worst thing they've done. Her final words, with great power must also come great responsibility, don't land like a comic book catchphrase. They're quiet, weighted, etched into his grief. And just when it feels like he can't carry anymore, he meets himself. Two versions from two different worlds, older, scarred, wiser, and through them, No Way Home becomes something extraordinary. Not a crossover, not a cameo fest, but a conversation across generations. Tobey Maguire's Peter, gentle and weathered. Andrew Garfield's haunted and aching. They don't just appear, they arrive with weight, with memory, with mistakes. They guide, not by telling Peter what to do, but by showing him what they've done and what they regret. The climax isn't about stopping a villain. It's about giving broken people a second chance, about rewriting endings, about choosing mercy when vengeance feels easier. And then comes the real sacrifice. To fix the spell, to restore the fabric of the multiverse, Peter must make everyone forget who he is. Not just his enemies, everyone. MJ, Ned, Happy, Strange, the entire world. He doesn't hesitate, he doesn't ask for praise, he just lets go. And in the final scenes, we see something new. Peter, in a small New York apartment, alone, with a police scanner, a GED prep book, a homemade suit, no tech, no Avengers, just a boy who knows what he's lost and still chooses to do the right thing anyway. No Way Home is spectacular, but beneath the spectacle, it's deeply human. It's a story about identity, not just the mask, but the name behind it. About how being a hero sometimes means becoming invisible, letting go of the life you wanted so others can keep theirs. It reminds us that heroism isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet promise to keep showing up, even when no one remembers you. Dr. Stephen Strange has always been a man who believes he's doing the right thing, even when the cost is high, even when it breaks the rules, even when it breaks him. He saved the world by breaking time, saved a teenager by fracturing space, and each time, the universe bent, but didn't break. Until now, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with fear, with a girl running through the stars, chased by something she doesn't understand. Her name is America Chavez, and she has the ability to open portals between universes, something she can't control, and something everyone else seems to want. Strange meets her, protects her, and quickly learns that the threat isn't coming from the stars. It's coming from someone he already knows. Wanda, but not the Wanda we left in WandaVision, not the grieving mother just beginning to let go. This Wanda has read the Darkhold, has searched every corner of the multiverse, and she's made a decision. If her children exist somewhere, even in another reality, then she'll find them, and she'll take them. Her pain has curdled into obsession, not because she's evil, but because she's broken. And the film doesn't make excuses for her, but it doesn't abandon her either. It sits with that hurt, that longing, that refusal to accept what can't be changed. Strange tries to reason with her, then to fight her. But what Multiverse of Madness does best isn't its battles or visuals, it's its mirrors. Because in every universe, Strange finds a version of himself. One who went too far, one who lost everything, one who traded kindness for control, one who caused more pain than he ever prevented. And slowly, painfully, how Strange begins to realize that the danger isn't just Wanda or the Book of the Damned. It's the choices he hasn't questioned, the belief that he always knows best, that only he can fix things. There's a version of him that caused an entire universe to collapse just by trying to undo a single moment. A version who whispers warnings through a cracked, haunted face. Another corrupted by power, destroyed by loneliness, and all of them are still him. The film bends space, time, logic. There's a universe made of paint, a fight with musical notes, a memory walk that reveals regret as much as it reveals history. But through it all, there's one quiet question running underneath. What kind of man are you when no one is watching? In the end, Wanda sees herself, not in battle, but in the eyes of the children she never had, the ones who recoil from her, not because they don't love her, but because they don't know her. And in that moment, the illusion breaks, not with a fight, but with grief. She ends it herself, not because she's beaten, but because she finally sees what her pain has done. Strange, too, changes, not completely, but enough to ask for help, to open himself to the idea that strength isn't just in mastery, but in connection, in trust, in letting someone else take the lead. And America, the girl who couldn't control her power, she learns, not from books or spells, but from being believed in. Multiverse of Madness is messy, unsettling, sometimes violent, but underneath the chaos, it's still about something small. Learning to face the version of yourself you're most afraid of, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to become them. Thor has always been a character caught between extremes, a god raised to fight, taught to rule, slowly learning that his greatest battles were never against monsters or armies, but within himself. Over the years, he's lost nearly everything. His father, his hammer, his kingdom, his brother more than once, and the woman he once thought he had all the time in the world with. Love and Thunder picks up with Thor drifting, still strong, still noble, still brave in all the ways that people expect a hero to be. But beneath the bravado, he's floating, detached from purpose, detached maybe from meaning. He's done the work of saving the world again and again, but somewhere along the way, he stopped asking himself why. The film opens not with him, but with Gore, a quiet, desperate man on a dying world, praying for salvation that never comes. And when he finds the gods he's worshipped all his life, he doesn't find wisdom or kindness. He finds vanity, indifference, and in that betrayal, something breaks. He becomes the god butcher not out of evil, but out of heartbreak. A man who believed and was punished for it. Gore's pain casts a long shadow over the film, even when the tone shifts into comedy and colour, because beneath the jokes and the goats and the flashy set pieces, Love and Thunder is really a story about belief, about who we put our faith in, and what we do when that faith is shattered. And then there's Jane Foster, who returns not as the love interest, but as a warrior in her own right. A scientist still searching for answers, now fighting a battle she knows she can't win. Cancer doesn't care about worthiness. It doesn't care about intellect or bravery. And so, when Jane lifts Mjolnir, she doesn't do it out of conquest or revenge. She does it to feel strong again, to take back some piece of herself, even if, deep down, she knows it's only temporary. Her reunion with Thor isn't fireworks, it's complicated. They still care for each other, that's never in question. But time and distance have turned that care into something quieter. There's love, but also fear. There's laughter, but also mourning, because both of them know this might be the end, even if they're not ready to say it out loud. As the story unfolds, the gods themselves are shown not as paragons of virtue, but as flawed, self-absorbed beings. Olympus is full of pageantry, but not compassion. Thor begins to realize that godhood means nothing without responsibility, that real power is not in lightning, but in sacrifice, in showing up even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And in the end, it's not strength that wins, not really. Gorr is defeated not with a weapon, but with a wish, with kindness, with a reminder of the love he lost and the love he could still protect. Thor doesn't kill him. He listens. He gives Gorr the space to choose something better. And when Gorr uses his final moments not to destroy, but to bring his daughter back, that's when the story finally breathes. Jane dies, not in fear, but in peace. She fades in Thor's arms, not as the mighty Thor, but as someone who lived her truth until the very end. Her strength wasn't in the hammer, it was in choosing how to spend the time she had left. Thor doesn't walk away alone. He takes Gorr's daughter, now infused with cosmic energy, and chooses to raise her, not as a soldier, but as someone who deserves a childhood. In the final scene, the god who had lost everything now cooks pancakes and teaches kindness, because love, it turns out, is just as heroic as thunder. Love and thunder is chaotic at times. It moves between tones like a needle skipping on a record. But in the spaces between, it finds something honest. A story not about saving the world, but about learning how to say goodbye, how to choose love when it's easier to run, and how to show up, even when you're not sure you're enough. Because sometimes, being a god means facing things you can't fix, and choosing to love anyway. Kamala Khan doesn't save the world in her first appearance. She doesn't crack open the multiverse, or battle ancient gods, or fight in space. She's just trying to make it to Avengers Con without disappointing her parents. And that's where Miss Marvel finds its strength. It's not a story about the end of the world. It's about trying to figure out your place in it. Kamala is a teenager from Jersey City, a fan, an artist, a dreamer. She worships Captain Marvel from afar, sketches herself in superhero poses during class, and makes fan videos that are equal parts clever and heartfelt. She's the kind of person who loves this world before she's ever really part of it. So when she suddenly gets powers, unexpected, messy, tied to a mysterious family heirloom, it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like confusion. She's not ready, not sure what to do with it, not even sure what it is. But that's exactly what makes her so real. Miss Marvel is a coming-of-age story told through bursts of colour, animation, and pop culture references. But at its heart, it's deeply personal. The show isn't just about Kamala discovering her abilities. It's about her discovering who she is in a world that keeps trying to tell her what she's not. She's Pakistani-American, Muslim, a daughter, a sister, a girl pulled between tradition and change. Her powers don't just set her apart, they bring her closer to a past she never fully understood. A history wrapped in stories of migration, of partition, of pain passed down through generations. Her journey takes her all the way to Karachi, where her grandmother tells her not just about magic, but about memory, about how sometimes the things that shape us aren't the stories we choose, but the ones we inherit. And in the middle of all this, Kamala starts to see that her power isn't just in glowing fists or energy shields, it's in connection to her culture, her family, her friends, herself. The show doesn't shy away from that complexity. It celebrates the chaos of community, the warmth of family dinners, the ache of being misunderstood, and the beauty of being fully seen. And at the center of it all is Kamala. Funny, awkward, kind, stubborn, and utterly sincere. By the end of the series, she doesn't become the perfect hero. She doesn't need to. What she becomes is something more meaningful. Someone who knows who she is. Someone who stands proudly in the middle of her many identities and claims all of them as her own. There's a moment near the end where her father tells her what her name means. Kamal in Urdu means marvel. And in that instant, everything shifts. The name, the powers, the journey, it all comes together, not as a tribute to someone else, but as her own beginning. Miss Marvel is a love letter to fandom, to family, to the messy process of growing up. It reminds us that you don't have to be perfect to be powerful. That legacy isn't about imitating your heroes. It's about becoming one in your own way. Because sometimes, The biggest superpower is knowing that you belong, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Jennifer Walters never wanted to be a superhero. She didn't ask for powers, or a costume, or a name the world could shout at her in all caps. All she ever wanted was to be good at her job, to be taken seriously in court, and maybe live a slightly less complicated life than her cousin Bruce. But the MCU rarely works that way. She-Hulk. Attorney at law begins not with destiny or trauma, but with an accident, a brief, unexpected moment of exposure to Bruce Banner's blood, and suddenly, Jennifer finds herself changing. Not slowly, not symbolically, but immediately and visibly. She grows taller, stronger, greener, and with that, everything shifts. There's no villain in the first episode, no looming threat, just an ordinary woman trying to return to her ordinary life in a world that's already decided she's something else now, something louder, something larger than life. But Jen doesn't want to be larger than life. She wants to go to work, go on a few awkward dates, win her cases, and maybe make it through dinner with her family without someone asking her about the Avengers. And that tension between how she sees herself and how the world sees her becomes the spine of the show. What follows is part legal comedy, part superhero satire, part sharp meta-commentary on fandom, internet culture, and the way women are treated when they don't conform to what stories expect them to be. Jen breaks the fourth wall constantly, not just for laughs, but to remind us that she's aware of the story she's in, and that she's not always happy with how it's being told. There are cameos, yes, Wong, Daredevil, even Bruce himself, but the heart of She-Hulk isn't in the crossovers. It's in the smaller moments. Jen wrestling with imposter syndrome, Jen facing criticism from trolls who say she didn't earn her powers. Jen realizing that being strong doesn't protect you from feeling alone. Through it all, the show plays with genre. It shifts tones, flips expectations, leans into absurdity without losing sight of the very real emotional thread running beneath it. It's messy by design, episodic, self-aware, and then, in the finale, it breaks entirely. In the final episode, Jen steps out of the narrative. Literally. She leaves her own show, confronts the writers, and rewrites the ending herself. Not because she wants to win, but because she wants control. She wants the right to tell her own story, her own way. That's the real superpower here. Not transformation, not strength, but authorship. She-Hulk doesn't end with a battle. It ends with a barbecue, with community, with laughter, with Jen, finally at peace with the idea that she doesn't need to be one or the other. She's both. She's herself. Because being a hero doesn't always mean saving the world. Sometimes it means knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone else define it for you. By now, the MCU is more than a saga. It's more than a collection of heroes or a sequence of battles. It's a constellation of lives, some cosmic, some grounded, all moving in and out of each other's orbits. And yet, even with multiverses collapsing, timelines breaking, gods falling, and realities bending, the stories still seem to circle back to the same thing. Loss, choice, legacy, connection. After Endgame, the universe doesn't feel like it's building toward a single moment anymore. It feels more like it's breathing, expanding sideways instead of upward, telling smaller stories, more personal ones, characters grieving, growing, laughing, questioning, wondering if being a hero is worth it when the world keeps changing underneath them. Moon Knight explores identity through a man who doesn't always know who he is. Hawkeye passes the torch with reluctance and warmth. Loki, the trickster, the survivor, finds love in the unlikeliest place, in a version of himself, as the sacred timeline unravels around him. We see Kang at the edges, a villain who isn't defined by rage, but by inevitability. A man who sees time not as a line, but as a web, and who believes control is mercy. There are hints that something big is coming again, but the story doesn't rush to tell us what it is. And maybe that's the point, because for all the grand arcs and spectacle, the The Marvel Universe has always been most compelling in the quiet moments. Steve dancing with Peggy, Peter hugging Ned, Kamala looking at herself in the mirror, Shuri holding back tears while trying to hold up a kingdom. These aren't just stories of superpowers, they're stories of people trying to live up to their own promises, of gods learning how to grieve, of scientists who can't fix what's broken, of kids who didn't ask to be chosen, of women who are tired of being told how they're supposed to feel, supposed to fight, supposed to look. It's messy, sometimes inconsistent, often surprising, but always, somewhere deep beneath the suits and the stars, there's heart. And in that heart, there's us. Because these characters, no matter how far they fly or how hard they fall, are just trying to make sense of the world, the way we all are. They're trying to hold on to the things they love, trying to forgive themselves, trying to find home, however that looks. And the stories go on. New heroes rise, old ones fade, some return, some don't. But the thread continues, woven through time, through space, through memory, not because it has to, but because there are always more stories to tell. And as the screen fades to black and the credits roll, you're left with the smallest, softest truth of all. Even in a universe this vast, you were never watching alone. Thank you for spending your night with Lost at 3 a.m. Sleep well, dream slow, and we'll see you next time.